So, you want us to beat an MMO?
Essentially.
You!
Whoa, getting a lot of hostility here. Don't appreciate it.
Well, honestly, when was the last time you heard of someone beating EverQuest?
When was the last time you heard of someone playing EverQuest?
That's fair.
Hello everyone. Today's topic is going to be about Guild Wars 2. For anyone who has been a long-term viewer of this channel, you would be aware that I absolutely love this game. I bought it on release day and I've been playing it relatively consistently for the past 11 years or so. I loved the first game, sinking hundreds of hours into it as a kid, and while the business model for Guild Wars 2 is on the more economical side for gamers, I've still sunk probably $1,000, if not far more, on this game because I support the developers and I want this game to thrive. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that a game whose business model should be requiring me to pay less money to enjoy it has received more money from me than Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft combined. But here's the problem. I think that ArenaNet's new development ideology is going to force the game into a downhill spiral. I think that if you objectively compare what we got out of previous content patches, pre-Icebrood Saga, to what we're getting nowadays, you'll find that the actual amount of new content that we're getting is staggeringly lower than what any of you might think. I think that the new development team somehow believes that they don't need to do much in the way of actual work anymore for some reason. And I also believe that when I show you some of the financial documents that I've poured through, you'll find that many of the public statements from ArenaNet are blatantly misleading PR stunts, and sometimes they're just straight up lying to their community. All of that and more are coming up, so if you're even remotely interested in Guild Wars 2, or just MMORPGs and game development in general, stay tuned. If you're not, well then this video might not be for you. Now, just as a prior warning, while this might seem like this video is going to be talking about Secrets of the Obscure, the newest expansion for Guild Wars 2, this video is not about Secrets of the Obscure. Not really. I haven't actually played the expansion, so this video is not going to be about my thoughts for the expansion, but rather a discussion about the current development team and why I'm not exactly their biggest fan these days. So there will not be any story spoilers in this video. With all of that out of the way, let's go back in history a little bit to gain some context on the situation. Guild Wars 2 has always had an interesting business model. You buy the game, and you own it. There is no sub-fee for Guild Wars 2. The only thing that you really spend money on besides new content in this game is the gem store, which contains cosmetics or minor quality of life upgrades. Now, some might debate that this is pay to win, because some of the things that you can buy in the gem store are incredibly powerful and arguably required by certain players these days, looking at you Copperfed Salvage-O-Matic, but you can actually convert your in-game currency, gold, into the premium currency, gems, and vice versa. What this means is that you can technically spend ungodly amounts of time and effort into farming up in-game gold, and then use that gold to buy items in the gem store, so technically speaking, nothing is pay to win. It's an interesting business model, but it does rely on the developers either consistently pushing content worth paying for, or graphical artists and developers creating cosmetic items worth buying from the gem store, because otherwise there's no passive income for this game. Are the items in the gem store probably overpriced? Sometimes, yeah, it can feel that way. I mean, $20 for a custom mount skin can seem like a lot of money, but if you compare that stuff to what other games in the genre do, like Final Fantasy XIV's $40 whale, which I did buy because I'm an absolute idiot, Guild Wars 2 almost seems kind of reasonable, especially when you remember that Guild Wars 2 has no sub-fee unlike other MMOs that are price gouging in their cosmetic shops, while also charging a subscription fee each month. Guild Wars 2 released on August 28th, 2012, and it was rated pretty highly at the time, even compared to other big games in the same genre, though it still wasn't really talked about all that much back in the day. Hell, it's not really talked about all that much today either. Even big MMO streamers and content creators often don't touch Guild Wars 2, probably because the game isolates itself from other games in the genre, to the point where it doesn't share many qualities and characteristics of an MMORPG. There isn't really a dedicated role system present in the game outside of the highest level of PvE content. You don't really have the holy triforce of RPG classes, tanks, healers, and dealers. You can quote-unquote tank enemies, but while enemies usually attack the player with the highest toughness stat or the player who is closest to them, sometimes enemies will just ignore these rules and attack whoever they want. You can play a build that can provide a lot of healing, but in most situations, players should be responsible for their own survival, at least outside of high-level PvE content like strikes and raids. And these roles do blur together, which is something that other MMOs simply don't do. You can play a build that heals and tanks, or a build that will provide buffs and deal a lot of damage. This is what Guild Wars 2 does very differently compared to other MMORPGs. This is what build diversity looks like. Is there a metagame in Guild Wars 2? Absolutely. Do most players respect it? Not really. As long as you know what you're doing, you don't really need a meta build to be useful in a party setting. I've run some absolutely crazy shit in raids and strikes, and my group did just fine, because I still learned the encounter and I knew what I was doing ahead of time. I didn't just rely on my meta build to carry my ass through the fight. In addition, Guild Wars 2 is not an idle game like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV. It's not some point-and-click adventure game. You have to actually move around in combat and use the dodge roll mechanics, and because you only have about 10 skills, you do need to be aware of your cooldowns and use skills properly and not just spam them as soon as they're off cooldown. All these aspects can turn off seasoned MMO players and content creators. Guild Wars 2 is just too different from many of the games that they've played in this genre, making it a less attractive option to play for an audience, especially if that audience is used to other more traditional MMORPGs. That's why the numbers for all the live streams on Twitch are so low, and that's why there's almost no one making Guild Wars 2 content on YouTube. I can name like 4 or 5 off the top of my head, in contrast with the massive army of World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV content creators that I know about. It's also worth mentioning that Guild Wars 2 is never at the top of any lists of the best MMO to play this year, and it's always overshadowed by far larger MMOs, even though, funny enough, Guild Wars 2 does things so innovative that other games tend to copy their homework, like the Defiance system in boss enemies, or some of the mount mechanics that we'll talk about later. Anyway, the game was fantastic on release. The personal story these days is a little dated, and the entire Zaitan arc is a little hard to stomach in some parts, but it's still a decent story, and it does mark the beginning of a fantastic decade-long story arc. And, unlike a certain other MMO that prides itself on its story, Guild Wars 2's story doesn't take hundreds of fucking hours to see the end of. It's simple, relatively easy to follow, it doesn't flood the character with this entire roster of characters whose names and backstories they need to remember in order to follow the story properly. However, I would like to argue that Guild Wars 2 really solidified its foothold in the MMO market as it began releasing expansions, both the full-scale ones and the Living World seasons, because these content expansions began to expand mechanical systems and core mechanics, while also building a wider progression system, which brings me to my next point. Guild Wars 2's progression philosophy, which is probably another reason why people tend to shy away from the game. Guild Wars 2 isn't like an MMO that will just increase the level cap for players and continues to feed them increasingly difficult challenges like EverQuest or Final Fantasy XIV. This is called vertical progression because the player progresses, well, vertically. But Guild Wars 2 does progression differently. Players progress horizontally instead. The level cap for Guild Wars 2 is level 80, and it's been level 80 since the game came out. How can that be? How can you introduce new challenges for players to conquer if their level remains the same? How can you give them new skills and abilities for their class if their level never increases? It's simple. You give them new ways to play their character. The first DLC for Guild Wars 2, Heart of Thorns, released in 2015, 3 years after the base game is released, introducing a ton of new stuff, but the two main systems of note are the Elite Specializations and Gliding. Elite Specializations are a sort of subtle nod to how Guild Wars 1 used to work. You see, in Guild Wars 1, you were basically able to pick 2 classes. You could be a Necromancer and a Warrior, or an Elementalist and a Monk. Elite Specializations in Guild Wars 2 are basically ways to merge aspects from other professions into the one that you're playing. For example, one of the Elite specs introduced in Heart of Thorns was the Reaper, turning the Necromancer into, well, a Grim Reaper. Normally, Necromancers have a Shroud ability that revolves around conditions and ranged attacks, but the Reaper gives the Necromancer access to a big-ass greatsword and transforms their Shroud into a melee powerhouse, as well as granting the Necromancer access to shouts, normally only given to Guardians and Warriors. This is how Elite specs work. They basically morph the fundamental systems present in a base profession into something completely new. They literally change the way that your class plays at the basic level, as well as adding in new skills that are similar to what other professions can already use. Another great example of this is the Weaver for the Elementalist. Normally, the Elementalist can only attune to a single element at a time: earth, fire, water, or air. But the Weaver allows the Elementalist to basically half-attune to elements, so that way you can attune to fire and water at the same time, changing your first 2 weapon skills to one element, and then the last 2 weapon skills to a second element, as well as granting you a brand new 3rd weapon skill based on the 2 elements that you have attuned to. This is similar to how the Thief profession class works, with their 3rd weapon skill changing based on what weapons they have equipped in each hand. This all sounds complicated, but if you're an Elementalist main, it sounds elementary. Hey, see what I did there? No, but in all seriousness, Elemental Spains have basically weaponized autism and it scares the living shit out of me. You guys are all lunatics. Anyway, the other system, gliding, basically allows the player to literally glide. They can jump off of a cliff and glide around like Link in Breath of the Wild, only in Guild Wars 2 your stamina doesn't run out in 5 seconds because the game actually wants you to use gliding to explore, unlike the recent Zelda games. This gliding system is still in the game to this day, and it's still incredibly useful to this day. Not only do the developers make gliding useful for exploring, but they also use it in combat sometimes. A dragon boss can breathe fire, covering the entire field in flames, but players can jump up and glide, using the rising hot air to catapult themselves upwards, avoiding the damage. This is a real fucking thing that happens in the game, in Heart of Thorns, in an open world combat encounter. Seriously, I've played a lot of MMOs in my time, and I've yet to come across any other game that creates combat encounters in an open world setting like this that feels so dynamic and interesting. It's honestly one of Guild Wars 2's greatest strengths, the event system. It's leagues ahead of Final Fantasy XIV's Fate system, that's for sure. Heart of Thorns also introduced the Mastery system and gave us the 9th and final class for the game, the Revenant, arguably my favorite class in the game because it's so unique compared to what other MMOs create for classes. Heart of Thorns also started the Guild Hall system, an instance combat encounter that you conquer with your guild members, taking over the place for yourselves and granting access to a fully customizable guild hall for your guild. Heart of Thorns, a great DLC, right? Well, Path of Fire comes out in September of 2017. What does this DLC add? There's no way that it adds something as cool as gliding, right? Well, not only did it add new elite specializations, new masteries, new guild halls, as well as a ton of other stuff, but it also added one of the most memorable features in Guild Wars 2 to this day, mounts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and play dumb. I did make a video a very, very long time ago about how Guild Wars 2 introducing mounts was going to be a bad thing. The video is not very good, and most of it has not aged tremendously well, which is evidenced by the fact that a lot of people disliked it, despite the fact that most of the comments in that video were actually positive. I guess you dislike whores don't actually want to give me your opinions, but you're totally fine just disliking mine, whatever. However, in that video, I did talk about how it was going to make maps feel empty and less dynamic, and that players would stop walking or gliding and just use their mounts instead. And for the most part, I was completely correct. Players these days absolutely just sit on their sky scales and never walk anywhere. It's a wonder how there isn't a terrible morbid obesity problem going on in Tyria, with everyone basically sitting in the equivalent of the Wally fat people floaty chairs all day long. Also, the Path of Fire maps are notorious for being fucking massive and one of the more annoying maps to fully explore for the map rewards. So a lot of what I said in that video eventually did end up coming true. But on the other hand, I was very wrong about the mounts themselves. In hindsight, Guild Wars 2 implemented mounts in such an amazing way that other MMOs began stealing from them. Yeah. World of Warcraft's Dragonflight expansion, the one that added dragon riding, do you know why it feels so awesome to ride a dragon in that game? That's because Guild Wars 2 did it first, and Blizzard basically stole the gameplay mechanics from ArenaNet.
So is this like the new WoW thing? Wait, was that Guild Wars? Oh.
Do you want to know the truth? This gives me more faith in Blizzard than anything else in the cinematic, because they're back to their roots. They're back to doing what they do best. Stealing other people's ideas.
That's how you know that you're succeeding in game development, right? Whenever a bigger company has to completely rip you off. In any case, Guild Wars 2 mounts are an insane experience. If you don't believe me, go watch some beetle racing videos on YouTube, or better yet, watch the Griffin riding videos. It's hard to believe that some of that footage is from a video game. I'm not going to talk about mounts a whole lot, they're really just something that every player needs to experience for themselves. Seriously, I can't equate the feeling into words. Every player really just needs to experience it for themselves. They're awesome. Anyway, Path of Fire also introduced the bounty system, providing a much-needed Radiant Quest-style PvE system for players to fight open-world bosses. Path of Fire, a great DLC, right? Well, here's where things get a little blurry and the game starts to spin out of control. You see, in between all these expansions, the developers were creating these things called living world stories. These are basically story quests that were added to the game without requiring the massive content expansions that a DLC would entail. You'd get a new story content, new areas sometimes, and often you would get new mastery tracks for new abilities or new ascended equipment, but for the most part, these were primarily used to tie the story into the next expansion. The unique thing about these Living World stories was that they were technically free for anyone who played the game as they were coming out. If you logged in as these were coming out episodically, they would be added to your account free of charge. Of course, if you missed the window to get them for free, you could buy them later on the gem store. These cost you between 960 gems and 1280 gems, which is roughly $12 to $16. Not a bad deal, but we'll go ahead and talk about that in a minute. I just wanted to point out the difference between a DLC and a Living World story. One has all sorts of new stuff, like new elite specs, along with usually an entirely new section of Tier to explore, as well as some kind of overarching gameplay element that is added to the game, such as gliding or mounts. The other is really just story. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about Icebrood Saga. What a fucking joke. This is a Living World story. Even the developers claim that it is a Living World story. It adds a few new areas, as well as a new PvE-style instance content called Strikes. These are a sort of quick and dirty boss fight similar to Trials in Final Fantasy XIV, but Icebrood Saga did not add any new elite specs or any new gameplay elements like mounts or gliding. Here's where things get weird. Icebrood was supposed to be an expansion. Path of Fire had a Living World season after it was released, and it's even weirder because Icebrood feels longer than other Living World seasons. It's almost as if the developers intended for it to become a full expansion, and then decided to focus on developing End of Dragons instead. Chronologically, the final chapter for Icebrood comes out in April of 2021. However, the next expansion, End of Dragons, was announced the previous year in March of 2020. However, the next DLC, End of Dragons, doesn't come out until March of 2022, over a year after Icebrood ends. Now, Icebrood Saga is widely considered the worst story arc of the entire game, and personally, I tend to agree. The first half of Icebrood is really good, but the second half includes absolutely batshit insane character choices, feels incredibly rushed, and trails a horrendous ex machina plot point that results in handling every antagonist of Icebrood Saga all at once. We're not going to talk about any spoilers obviously, but for anyone who's actually played this thing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that was it. For an entire year, players finished Icebrood, experienced the shitty ending of that arc, and then had to stew and wait for months and months. And then ArenaNet comes back like Gandalf the White. They finally come out with End of Dragons, taking place in Cantha, a beloved region from the first game. It releases in March of 2022, it includes new elite specs, a whole new continent to explore, a new sailing system using pretty sweet boats in any body of water, even in areas that have been in the game for a decade. Take notes, Final Fantasy XIV, nobody likes your shitty, stupid diving system. And it even includes a new fishing system. It also includes all the bells and whistles of the past expansion packs, with new mastery tracks, new stat blocks for equipment, all that jazz. It even includes a new Jadebot system, allowing you to have a handy little drone that you can use. I don't really use it, but a lot of people seem to like it. Now, personally, I wasn't a fan that we didn't get anything resembling a Ritualist elite spec, and if anyone gives me any bullshit about Guardian or Revenant being a Ritualist, I will actually fucking fight you. I also wasn't a fan that the iconic cities stacked on top of each other from the first game were absent from modern-day Cantha. The new city is cool to look at, sure, but I honestly kind of miss the grimy and dystopian feeling that I got from walking around Kaining City in Guild Wars 1. The new elite specializations were fine, though I will argue that a handful of them were tremendously imbalanced on release, and it took a very long time before ArenaNet managed to balance them properly. Yes, I'm looking at you, Mechanist. Keep in mind, this is coming from a guy who thinks that PvE balancing should be pretty fast and loose, and even I was like, holy shit, Mechanist is way too good. Why aren't Ranger pets this good? This feels kind of unfair. But whatever, the DLC is fantastic, and it represents a pretty decent end to the Elder Dragon cycle arc that ArenaNet has spent the past 10 years building out. I did like End of Dragons, maybe less so than Heart of Thorns or Path of Fire, but it was still a very good expansion for the game, and it definitely is worth the $30 for what it adds to the game as a whole. And I also think that it somehow managed to sweeten the sour taste in everybody's mouth after the nonsense that was Icebrood Saga. And now here we are. This is where the video is probably going to turn controversial. I've actually recorded and then rewritten the second half of this video about 6 different times, because I'm trying to avoid resorting to ad hominem attacks and then bitching and complaining about the game, and I'm going to try to just feed you the facts instead. The newest expansion, Secrets of the Obscure, came out last year in August of 2023. You might be asking yourself, was there a Living World story in between this one and End of Dragons? The answer is no, another red flag, because traditionally Living World stories are used to tie the story into the next DLC, but whatever. What features does this new DLC include? Any new elite specs? Any new gameplay elements like the ones introduced in previous expansions? How about new legendary weapons? No to all of that. You could argue that the new Skyscale Mastery track could be included in the same category as boats or gliding or mounts, but I would argue that the new Mastery track, however well the Skyscale behaves in the new DLC aside, isn't anywhere close to the raw content of previous DLCs. They're not even close. Giving Skyscales and Griffins the ability to use updrafts and ley lines are not equivalent to sailing and gliding. The player could already use these, you just gave them more of a reason to never hop off their goddamn mounts. Fantastic design choice, ArenaNet. We didn't even get any new elite specs, one of the most highly sought after new content in expansions, at least for veteran players, because they introduced new ways to play a class, and that's very important for horizontal progression systems. How is this a fucking expansion? End of Dragons didn't introduce any new raids, but it did at least give us 4 new strike missions, and Secrets of the Obscure only gives us 2. No new raids. We do get a new Fractal, but nobody fucking plays Fractal anymore. That content has been dead for a very long time because ArenaNet never updated the old Fractals properly, so now you have these very fun to play modernized Fractals mixed in with this pool of outdated and buggy content. No new stat blocks for any of our equipment, no new guild hall, no new legendary weapons, no new mounts, no new gliding masteries. The only actual new systems that we got are the Weapon Master training, which basically allows a player to use weapons from elite specs that you don't have equipped. Cool, I guess. This is something that people have been demanding for years anyway, and it didn't really make any sense to lock new weapon skills behind elite specs in the first place. So this is really just ArenaNet reversing a bad development decision 8 years late. The other thing that we got are new weapons for each profession. That's right, every class gets a new set of weapons. It's sort of like giving us a new elite spec, but without the actual elite spec, just the new weapon. Oh right, the weapons aren't even fucking out yet! The DLC released in August. I'm making this video 6 months later in February of the following year. We still don't have the expanded weapon proficiencies yet. It's been 6 months. What's fucking taking so long? Why was this DLC released with half of the features excluded? Why are we waiting around for new shit when the DLC dropped half a year ago? Even if you give them a pass for not making any actual new mechanic systems, they could have at least revamped some of the older content. How about going back and redoing the personal story because it has not aged very well? You already did that for the first season of Living World Story. Why not do it for the personal story as well? I mentioned fractals earlier. I know that they added 1 new fractal, but we're still missing 3 more to complete a full set of 25 for each tier. While we're at it, are we able to rework some of their fractals so that way they're not complete ass? I've yet to meet a player who actually enjoys the Jade Maw fight. It is horrendous. What about dungeons? The story instances for the dungeons are basically all able to be soloed, which is bananas to me. Also, if these instances are telling the story about how Destiny's Edge gets back together at the city of Arad towards the end of the Zayatan arc, why not just move these into the personal story and require the player to do every single story mode dungeon 1 time? I'd be down for that. And the explorable mode instances are batshit insane and need to be scaled down properly, because half the mechanics instantly kill players without any warning, and the other half are easily cheesed by very experienced dungeon running groups. We're supposed to be getting a new legendary armor set in the newest expansion, but again, it's February, 6 months after the DLC came out, and we still don't have access to it yet. Also, we're probably not even getting the complete set until the last content update in another 3 months. We're probably only going to be getting the precursor set here in February. Speaking of armor, well, we did get 4 new armor sets, 5 if you count the legendary armor that isn't out yet. That's still a far cry from the 6 armor sets introduced in all the previous DLCs. Not only are there less armor sets available in Secrets of the Obscure, but they also don't have any weight variants. What I mean by this is that the light, medium, and heavy version of the armor are all identical no matter what class you play, which is fine. Like, I always thought it was kind of weird that we had weight-locked armor in the first place, but each armor set in the DLC had 3 variants, so even though the past DLCs included 6 armor sets, that's technically 18 sets of armor if you count all the different variants. Secrets of the Obscure barely includes a third of that content. I do think that the new armor sets are okay. They're not the worst in the game, but they're definitely not the best. And if ANET's current dev team is going for quality over quantity, they're not really doing either one. The new Rift hunting system is basically just the bounty system from Path of Fire, but with extra steps. It is not a new system by any stretch of the imagination. The new relic system was unneeded and basically made runes obsolete. None of the new relics are build defining. I didn't read any of them and go, ooh, that is going to be so fucking sick. They're kinda whatever. They're kinda mid. They're meh. It's marginally more customizable to be able to obtain a rune's tier 6 effect by itself without having to stack the stats from a rune that you don't want, sure. But do you know what actually would have been cool? Keeping the tier 6 rune effects while also introducing the relic system, allowing players to basically have 2 of the set bonuses from runes at the same time. That would have been actually interesting instead of what we got in the end. Let's talk about the new development plan. Back in spring of 2023, an article was released detailing the new development plans for the game. This article basically stated that the development team was going to be taking a different approach to expanding the game, and instead of releasing a full expansion every 2 to 4 years with one season of a living world in between, they're going to be releasing smaller expansions at a lower price much more frequently. This is so that they can adopt a more consistent release schedule, minimize content droughts, and increase our support for the core game. We're going to talk about this article later on, but for now, let's just go ahead and focus on the game development plans. First off, we're losing Living World seasons, and those were technically free for active players, so keep that in mind. Also, the amount of content that we're getting under this new development plan is far less than what we used to get. Statistically, in the 5 months since Secrets of the Obscure has launched, ANET has pushed out a single content patch. That's it. And in that content patch, titled Through the Veil, they added a new story act comprised of 3 chapters, a new mastery track, some new weapon skins, and a new zone, as well as some new miniatures and a new armor set. Compare that with a single random chapter of a Living World story. For example, Living World Season 3's episode number 3, A Crack in the Ice, which added to the game a single story act comprised of 7 chapters, a new zone, a new mastery track, a new legendary weapon, a new armor skins, new ascended gear, and a new fractal, as well as a bunch of miniatures, new food, and a new reward track for World v World and PvP. By the way, I picked this Living World episode at random. I did not pick it because it had this much goddamn content. Just so that none of you think that I'm full of shit and I'm trying to make Secrets of the Obscure look bad with an unfair comparison, let's go ahead and pick another episode at random. Let's go ahead and do Living World Season 4 this time, The Rise of Kralkatorrik. Which episode? There are 6 in total, so let's go ahead and use a random number wheel spinner to choose. Great, also episode 3, Long Live the Lich. I actually remember this one because the story is very, very good. What did this episode add? It added 5 new story chapters to the game, along with a new zone, a new mount, the Roller Beetle, a new legendary weapon, 2 new back item skins, an entirely new armor set, a bunch of new minis and novelties, a new PvP and World v World track, a new stat block, Plague Doctors, and a new fractal Deepstone, along with a bunch of other random stuff like new gem store packages and die kits, that sort of thing. I mean, just look at the sheer volume of content between these patches. It's fucking night and day. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, they are releasing content patches more consistently every 3 months, and they're going to be making one of these expansions every year. Through the Veil came out in November of last year. That's 3 months after the release of Secrets of the Obscure. The developers have stated that one of these content patches will be coming out each quarter, which means 3 months to a single content patch. Living World Season 4 had 6 episodes total, spanning November 2017 to May of 2019. That's 6 episodes across 18 months. Well, wouldn't you know it, the math works out to about 1 content patch every 3 months. What about Living World Season 3? First episode came out in July of 2016. The 6th and last episode came out in July of 2017, exactly 1 year later. That's 6 episodes in 1 year, or 2 months per content patch. ArenaNet is full of shit. They were pumping out objectively larger content patches for free if you were playing at the time, remember, at the same rate that they are now. Secrets of the Obscure is allegedly only going to be receiving 3 chapters, 3 content patches, and these content patches are objectively smaller than a Living World store update would have been. What's the price of Secrets of the Obscure? $25? What's a Living World season cost you in the gem store? $12? It costs half the price and you get twice the content out of it. How is this not a scam? How does the current development team think that any of this is remotely okay? Which makes it especially confusing when, in the same article in spring of 2023, the question, do smaller expansions mean that there are fewer developers working on Guild Wars 2, which was replied with, nope, quite the contrary. In fact, thanks to the growth that Guild Wars 2 saw in 2022, we are increasing the size of the development team, largely in content and systems design. How the hell are you telling us that you're expanding your staff while also telling us that you want to release content more consistently when you're doing objectively less work? That's what this is, by the way, less work. You are doing less work for the game from a content standpoint while telling us that you're adding staff. This is not the flex that you think it is. All you're doing is telling us that you're either lazy or you're bad at managing your developers, or both. The real problem is that the article goes on to state that they want to focus on the core game, stuff like the story up to level 80, professions, dungeons, fractals, crafting, etc. But nothing that they're adding in these content patches are achieving that purpose. They're not adding in new races to flesh out the character customization aspect of the game. They're not allowing players to pick and choose their own character's voice. I've been complaining about the player's voice being tied to their race for years now. Guild Wars 2 has some incredible voice acting, and they really should allow players to pick what voice they get to use. They're not adding new weapons to ever diversify the weapon gameplay. I'm still waiting for the ability to use spears or halberds on land ArenaNet. Those are one of the most common weapons in the world from a historical standpoint, and we still can't use them. How about adding controller support? To use Guild Wars 2 on a controller, you have to use some insane third-party software, and even then, it's pretty janky. This game, unironically, would behave pretty well on a controller, and it's insane how ArenaNet has not accomplished this yet. They didn't do any of that. They basically just gave flying mounts the ability to use updrafts and ley lines, and then they go to the rune system and slapped a $25 price tag on it. How is this focusing on the core game? That is a laughable statement to make. Here's my problem with ArenaNet these days. End of Dragons worked. Path of Fire worked. Heart of Thorns worked. Their development plan worked. It brought new players into the game every expansion, and every expansion seemed worthwhile because each one added a consistent mountain of content. You could expect that every expansion added a new elite spec for every class, a new set of areas to explore, a new guild hall to claim for your guild, new raids or strikes, new masteries, new legendary gear, that sort of shit. Stuff that actually keeps players playing the game. Apparently now ArenaNet developers seem to think that only having one or two of these bullet points each expansion is adequate for a similar price tag. Remember, every expansion so far had a price tag of $30. $30 for that entire mountain of content. The newest expansion has a price tag of $25. 83% of the price tag for maybe 50% of the content. This is not a good deal. Why not just take the extra year of development and create a full-sized expansion pack instead of whatever the fuck this is? That would be consistent, not this. I have no idea if the next DLC is even going to have elite specs in it. I don't know if it's going to have legendary weapons in it. I don't know if it's going to have mounts in it, or a new crafting profession, or even a new continent to explore. I don't know because it's not consistent anymore. I'm doubting the consistency of the new expansion packs now. Isn't that what the developers wanted to alleviate? Inconsistency? While I was writing the script, I found an interview that the game director did with a website called WCCF Tech with an Alicio Palumbo. I really hope that I'm pronouncing your name right. In this interview, the game director, who we will talk about in a few minutes, trust me, straight up claims that the next expansion is not going to have elite specs in it at all, and that the team is leaning more towards adding weapons to each profession instead of actual elite specializations. So, no, we're not even going to be getting new elite specs in the next DLC. Go fucking figure. Let's talk about balance patches. These have, unfortunately, been pretty controversial since about Icebrood Saga. I don't really remember these patches creating much drama in the community pre-Icebrood, but I could be remembering wrong, who knows. Anyway, these fuckers come out every 3 months, give or take, and every time that they do, I have to hold my breath because each profession update makes absolutely zero sense to me, or pretty much any sense to the rest of the community. The balance changes that the game is pushing forth these days are bad. They are just bad. I'll give you just 2 examples because if I didn't restrict myself, this section of the video would be 20 minutes long, and this video is going to be plenty long enough already by all the looks of things. Keep in mind that I'm only picking 2 examples about one topic: quickness boon support. This is just one aspect of the game. Again, I could go on and on and on about all sorts of other shit that was badly balanced or changed over time that was a terrible idea. Revenant. The Herald Elite spec used to be able to give out quickness rather easily by just consuming facets, which is something that you likely did anyway, naturally, as you played the class, but last year this was changed, and now the quickness has been swapped away from the boon support trait Draconic Echo, and moved into Elevated Compassion, which was the go-to healing trait for literally forever. Now, you only pulse quickness while you are using 6 energy or more, also called being at negative upkeep, which most Revenant players do not ever maintain for a long period of time, because if you run out of energy as a Revenant, you are fucking useless for about 10 seconds, or you are forced to swap legends. So now the quickness build feels like you're playing a fucking piano, and your quickness basically comes out in short bursts instead of consistently over time. Not exactly a very user-intuitive method of granting the class access to a boon that it really should have access to. And you compound that with the fact that ArenaNet basically just negated the validity of trait variety. It used to be that Elevated Compassion was the healing trait and Draconic Echo was the boon support trait. Now there's no reason to ever run Draconic Echo as the support herald, period. They've now removed build variety with this change. Great change, ArenaNet. They also gave no indicated explanation as to why they made this change. Just, oh, by the way, this has changed now. Have fun, idiots. I can't find any justification in patch notes or community posts or any other forum explaining why this change was necessary from the developers. Warrior. Warrior has been in a rough spot for a pretty long time. The only reason to play this class after the unique buff removals from the game was for DPS, and that was about it. This class provided little to no boon support to a group for, what was it, about a year? Warrior was widely considered to be the worst class in PvE for this entire year. You almost never saw warriors in PvE content during this era. And then, ArenaNet gave them quickness on their banners. It helped tremendously, and you began seeing warriors more and more often outside of instance content. Then again, last year, ArenaNet reversed their decision and made banners apply resolution instead. It's not like every single fucking class in the game has a method of applying resolution already, but okay. If Warrior now wants to provide quickness, they now need to use the Berserker Elite spec and constantly spam out burst skills. That sounds super fun and definitely not tremendously shitty and boring, ArenaNet. Great change, guys. But no, let's go ahead and buff Guardian again because ArenaNet's Golden Child clearly isn't strong enough. At this point, if I ever do end up playing Guild Wars 2 ever again, I'm just gonna be a Guardian main from now on. Why wouldn't I? ArenaNet seems to buff it every single fucking balance patch. It's only gonna get stronger from now on. Also, let's go ahead and neuter Scourge for the Necro because every support build has to have Alacrity or Quickness, right? It's not like Scourge is literally the best class in the game for reviving other players. Let's go ahead and tone back how good it is at reviving, that way we have an excuse to give it Alacrity instead. It's like they're trying to blur the lines between all the boon support builds and really just all the elite specs in general. They're going down the same route that Final Fantasy XIV did back in Stormblood. They're trying to make every class feel the same, stripping any balance of class identity from the game. It's stupid. Why are they doing this? Why are they focusing so hard into quickness and alacrity? Why not give more professions access to boons like Aegis or Stability, or even create new boons to add into the game? ArenaNet is focusing solely on giving these boons to every profession when they really should be focusing on making every class feel unique and bring a unique presence to a group of players. What's especially infuriating to me is that we had to wait 6 months for the new weapons to come out because they needed to be quote-unquote beta tested, but none of these changes are ever beta tested. It's baffling to me. It's like, oh yeah, new skills, yeah, those need to be tested extensively, but when it comes to sweeping class revamps, ArenaNet is like, yeah, fucking send it. Also, I'm calling it now, bets on the new weapon skills still being buggy as shit when they release. After 6 months of beta testing, they are still going to hit the live environment buggy. I'm calling it right now. Why did I make this video? Secrets of the Obscure has been out for 6 months, and I waited until now to make a video? Why? To be totally honest with you, I was tempted to make a video when the DLC dropped back in August, but I wanted to wait and see what the first couple of content patches would look like before I came to any, how shall I say, outspoken judgments. I wanted to see what all these new developers would do before I made a video trashing them for their new design philosophy. I gave them the benefit of the doubt and they still let me down. The reason I finally decided to make this video is because of an article published at the end of 2023 titled A Year to Remember, written from the perspective of the game director for ArenaNet, Joshua Davis, and yes, I have no problem putting his name and his face on screen because he attached his name and face to this article. Now, Mr. Davis left the company in 2016 and returned to ArenaNet in March of 2021, later taking the role of game director in December of that year. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that every single negative thing plaguing Guild Wars 2 is entirely Mr. Davis' fault, because that wouldn't be fair and it also just isn't true. Icebrood came out years before Mr. Davis came back to ArenaNet and assumed the role of game director. However, I'm also sure that it's entirely coincidental that the game's worst 2 expansions, sweeping unpopular balance changes, and development shifts such as no living world stories anymore or any real content to keep veteran players active in the game, have all occurred under the leadership of Mr. Davis. The article kind of got under my skin, as you'll soon understand why. It starts with thanks for a great year, yada 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 whatever. Then it goes on to state that all the same shit I mentioned earlier in the previous article about more consistent release schedules, eliminating content drought, but it also mentions that their new development plan allows them to quote-unquote make strides towards improving work-life balance for our developers. And this is where I began to fume. What work? You expanded your development staff up to the number of staff that ArenaNet had during the Living World Season 4, arguably the peak of Guild Wars 2 in my opinion, and yet you're doing less work than you were during this time period, and at a much lower quality. I would understand if Mr. Davis was a part of the team churning out content pre-Icebrood Saga, but he wasn't. In fact, most of the current development staff wasn't present during that era. I went through the entire list of ArenaNet staff, and the only game designers that I can find that were working on the game in 2012 and are still with the company are this guy, and this guy. All three of them have been with the company since at least 2012 when Guild Wars 2 came out, and are still with the company as of this recording. Why aren't one of them in charge of directing the game? Why did ArenaNet allow this guy, who is basically only known in the community as a professional PvP player and a streamcaster, become the goddamn game director? We'll talk about him in a minute because he does become pretty relevant to one of my major plot points later on, but when the game director who has been there for 2 years tells us that they're trying to balance work and life, that's a bit of a bad joke to me, because most of the staff in the development team right now were not around when the game was churning out content at a much faster pace and at a much higher quality than whatever the fuck these guys are doing now. Seriously, your team didn't even make a Living World season post End of Dragons. What are you even complaining about? You gave us like one content patch post End of Dragons, and then you went off and developed half of an expansion and released it anyway, and now you think that you're allowed to pat yourselves in the back? It's fucking laughable. The article goes on to say that, quote-unquote, big changes like this are just as nerve-wracking for us as they are for you, but it's safe to say that we are breathing a lot easier these days. I'm sure you are breathing a lot easier. I'm sure it's a lot easier to breathe when you aren't expected to do any actual work for the game that you're supposedly in charge of developing. Funny how that works. I'm incredibly proud of what the team delivered with Secrets of the Obscure. Really? You're proud of this fucking thing? You must have lower standards than I do, because as I've basically proven, this is half of an expansion pack that you're treating as if it's made of gold when it's nowhere near the level of quality and content that previous expansions provided. And in addition to being a great content update, it wasn't. It was also a financial success for us. So were past expansions. In fact, I was so curious about this that I actually dredged up the earnings reports for ArenaNet, more specifically their parent company NCSoft. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't like NCSoft. I don't think many people that knew about all their past controversies would. NCSoft are the guys that bought the City of Heroes IP and then promptly ran the game into the ground and then basically liquidated the entire Paragon Studios and killed off that entire franchise. Anyway, the NCSoft is a publicly traded corporation, and thus all of its shareholder reports are public record. You can look up any of their fiscal quarters since 2009 and check how much all of their games were making each quarter. Now, in this article, released in March of 2022, titled The Future of Guild Wars 2, it states that End of Dragons sold more units than Path of Fire. Keep this statement in mind as we tackle this next section. Keep in mind that ArenaNet just claimed that End of Dragons sold more units than Path of Fire. Now, we don't have any actual numbers for these sales, but again, we do have the fiscal quarter history of NCSoft over the past 15 or so years, and I've actually taken the data from each quarter over time since August of 2012, since whenever Guild Wars 2 came out, up until Secrets of the Obscure, released last year in August of 2023. And I even put them into a very nice and neat little spreadsheet for you. Just to remember, these earnings are in South Korean won, and the exchange rate as of this morning is one US freedom dollar to about 1,300 South Korean won. Anyway, as you look at the spreadsheet, you can see that it basically tells a story. First off, the lowest profits ever recorded for Guild Wars 2 was quarter 4 of 2019, where it only made 11 million won, and the quarters following it are pretty bad too. If you remember, 2019 is the year that Icebrood Saga began coming out. This was probably a pretty rough time period financially because players were expecting a full expansion, and instead they got this absolute masterpiece of a story arc. But here's where things get interesting. When you look at quarters that followed an expansion's release, specifically quarter 4 of 2015, quarter 4 of 2017, and quarter 2 of 2022, you start to see that, quite frankly, ArenaNet's dev team is lying to themselves and their community. End of Dragons did not outsell Path of Fire. Stop lying. There is no fucking way that End of Dragons sold more units than Path of Fire or even Heart of Thorns. It just didn't. It's not physically possible. Not unless people spent 5 times more in the gem store that quarter for some unknown reason. So, no, ArenaNet is definitely lying about this. I don't even know why they would lie about this. It's public record. Did they think that no one would ever fact-check their statements? Because I assure you, I am indeed petty enough to fact-check this shit. Besides the manipulation and lying that the current development team is using to make themselves feel better about their subpar work ethic, these numbers do reflect a statistical incongruence in how ArenaNet works. It's like, I have the numbers to prove that you are doing shit wrong. Your old development strategy was statistically more effective and earned you more money, and you did it at some times with less employees. Imagine what you could do with your current staff if you actually worked them. Given the uncertainty in the economy as a whole and the gaming industry in particular right now, we are feeling very blessed and grateful to our fans for the level of stability that we've been able to maintain through this change. What are you even talking about? The video game industry grew economically in 2023. Your sector, the PC market, grew almost 6%. What are you even supposed to be saying here? This guy does not know what he's fucking talking about. Let's go back to that article from March of 2022 titled The Future of Guild Wars 2. There are actually a ton of statements in here worth pointing out because while a lot of this sounds positive, when you understand the fundamental history behind the game, you start to realize that a lot of this is just really deceptive PR tactics. Take this statement for example. In fact, the number of active Guild Wars 2 players has more than doubled in the past 3 years. Yeah, I'm sure it did. You went from not releasing any fucking content for 11 months after dropping the worst story arc in the history of the game in 2019 to releasing a full-scale expansion in 2022. That would bring back players no matter what you created inside of End of Dragons. This is not the flex you think it is. This is just common sense applied to a rudimentary ruse to cover up a lapse in communication and development from your company. Now, this section talks about Joshua Davis, the current game director for Guild Wars 2. It states that he was a community content creator, which is not a title by the way, but it also states that he joined the, quote, dev team in 2013. But according to his wiki page, that's not what his job title was. He was employed as a global brand manager / feature team product owner from 2013 to 2016 when he eventually left the company. I even looked at his LinkedIn page, he actually left the company to go work at Amazon as a senior marketing manager / head of community. Then he returned to work at ArenaNet as a director of live operations, which is a little baffling to me because I don't see anywhere in his fucking job description of having a background in game development. Still confused as to how he ended up becoming the game director, but whatever. The next section includes a whole paragraph from Josh talking about what they did to bring the game back, including, quote, taking stock of where we succeeded and where we fell short, spoke to those at the studio who were here for the highs and the lows, and dug into the mountains of data covering the span of the game's operation. No, you didn't. As I've pointed out, there's like a handful of game developers that still work at ArenaNet that were there for the game's highs. Your sample size could not have been exactly large in this regard. Quote, we need to prioritize delivering consistent updates for our players. You already were delivering consistent updates for your players, as I've already talked about. You're dancing around the subject. You're talking about Icebrood Saga and what happened for the year after Icebrood Saga. Just come out and say it and stop using fluff words to mask what you're talking about, dude. It makes you look really deceitful whenever you talk like this. The next section covers the Steam launch. Quote, one of our top priorities as a studio is getting Guild Wars 2 ready for release on Steam. You only get to launch on Steam once, and we want to make sure that we do it right. You didn't. You did not do the Steam release correctly. If you had, I would be playing on Steam right now, wouldn't I? But I'm not. I'm still using the old launcher because if I wanted to start playing on Steam, I would have to start over completely from scratch. Which is insane because other MMOs have integrated with Steam and allowed users to maintain their user accounts. Do you know which MMO did this? Guild Wars 1. I played Guild Wars 1 as a child and integrated my ArenaNet account seamlessly into the Steam version of the game. And even if that weren't true, there are plenty of other MMOs that converted it into Steam without requiring players to completely start over on their accounts. Also, the Steam version of Guild Wars 2 can't run on Linux, which is a massive red flag. Also, you can't even link a Steam Guild Wars 2 account with your Guild Wars 1 account. So, your Steam launch, not exactly encouraging behavior. I also do find it kind of entertaining to point out all the comments in the video trailers released on YouTube recently, showcasing the rift hunting system or the trailers for the new maps because, well, all the comments are very, very negative. And I also find it hysterical how Joshua Davis is basically an ex-marketing director, and everyone in the comments of these trailers of the more recent Guild Wars 2 videos are trashing the marketing team for ArenaNet and how the old trailers used to be a lot better. All of this aside, their financials, their blatant disregard to actually work on the game anymore, their blatant lies, and their obvious lack of internal communication, all that out of the way, if you look at the roadmap for these expansions, if you look at ArenaNet's plan for each content update, from a logical perspective, we also just aren't getting as much as we used to. Look at each content update. Do you see how each content update is basically just adding in stuff that should have been released when the expansion came out? Most of the, quote, new content that they're adding is shit that should have been in the game when the expansion dropped back in August. If you exclude all of this, you start to realize that there's barely anything new being added to the game. Take the update that's coming out later this month, the second patch for the Secrets of the Obscure. titled The Realm of Dreams, the one that is supposed to finally give us the new weapon skills. If you remove the weapon skills, along with everything else that should have been added upon the expansion release, the final map extension, the mastery updates, the legendary armor tier 1, and the legendary relic, you realize that we're only getting a new story chapter, a challenge mode for a strike mission, and new legendary enemies. That's it. 3 new things. Even if you assume that they're going to be adding in new weapon skins like they did in the previous expansion patch, that's not enough to be waiting around for 3 months for. It's just not. I cannot justify what they're doing. If this isn't lazy, I don't know what is. It feels like they're adopting the weird AAA game development strategy of releasing a game half finished and then just patching in the holes later. Except, rather than a full game, they're using that strategy with the expansion packs instead. If ArenaNet was actually releasing full-scale expansion packs, I could deal with the loss of the Living World seasons. I really could. But they aren't. They're not developing Living World content anymore, and they're releasing what is essentially half of an expansion in what are 4 stages throughout the course of an entire year, instead of just waiting and releasing a full expansion completely on release like a normal fucking game developer would. This actually feels kind of disgusting to put into words for the first time. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, why aren't you playing Guild Wars 2 if you like it so much? Why aren't you using Guild Wars 2 footage in this video at all? The reason is simple, I haven't played Guild Wars 2 in a very long time. In fact, I haven't left Mistlock Sanctuary since probably January of last year. I log in every couple of weeks to see if anything cool is on the gem store, but otherwise I haven't really actively played the game in over a year for one solid reason. You might think it's because I don't have anything to do or something, but that's not the case. I have plenty to do and I would love to play the game, but the game physically doesn't run well on my PC anymore. You see, in January of 2023, last year, the game developers tossed out DirectX 9 support. Period. You literally cannot render the game in DX9 anymore. It has to be rendered in DX11. Now, some of you don't know what any of that means, and that's fine. What this basically means is that ArenaNet has essentially cut off anybody whose PC doesn't run DX11 games all that well or at all. You see, some older GPUs don't support DX11, or if they do, they don't end up running it very well. My GPU is one such case. It doesn't run DX11 all that well, and it struggles really with any game that forces it to render in DX11. Guild Wars 2 simply doesn't run well anymore. Colors will get brightly saturated out of nowhere at certain times, and I will sometimes even get missing texture errors. And the game itself is also hard on my eyes to look at anymore. I used to play Guild Wars 2 for at least a couple of hours a day without any issue, and as soon as this DirectX update came out, it was fucking unbearable for me on my eyes. Also, I'd like to talk about why when I play this game it tells me that I'm getting 50 to 60 FPS, but my eyes still hurt to look at the game for more than 10 minutes, and it doesn't look like 60 FPS, which is especially confusing whenever I open up my GPU software and I find that Radon is tracking the game at an average of 26 FPS. Seems like the game itself is lying about how well that it's running on my PC, huh? So I can't play Guild Wars 2. I cannot, in good faith, play a game that used to run in 60 plus FPS at a third of that. I just can't. So I haven't played Guild Wars 2 in well over a year. I want to play the new expansion, and ironically, the concept art for the new maps look absolutely incredible, and the finished product is just as good in my opinion. This is one of ArenaNet's strongest departments, translating concept art into actual in-game models. This is what makes me excited to explore the game. And the new legendary armor sets that we're getting is pretty much exactly like the concept art, which is awesome because it all looks pretty good in my opinion. And I'm sure that if you look at just the new story and the new content, it's probably decent. The writing during Icebrood Saga might have been terrible, but I actually kind of like the story throughout End of Dragons. But me being excited to experience the new Secrets of the Obscure content does not excuse all the other bullshit that I've pointed out in this video. The content might be good, but we are still getting objectively less of it than we used to. Now, I'm never one to assume that somebody who did something wrong did it out of malice. I tend to think the best of people until they give me a very good reason to not believe in them anymore. But with all this evidence, all this history of this current development team, I can't come to any conclusion other than malice. This has to be intentional, right? They've released contradictory news releases, they've lied about sales numbers, and they're acting as if they're working super hard when they clearly aren't. It really seems like a very cushy job, only having to pump out some weapon skins and new enemies every 3 months. I would take that fucking job in a heartbeat. And before any of you think that I'm being too hard on ArenaNet right now, I wouldn't give these guys shit if I didn't think that any of them could do better. I know that they can do better, because they've released multiple fantastic games and expansions in the past. This is not an issue with the company as a whole, at every level of employee. This is specifically a game development issue. This isn't like Blizzard, where I've given up trying to make sense of their downfall. Blizzard is not recovering from all the bullshit that they've pulled in the past decade. They're just not. That company is not making a good video game ever again. I've accepted that fact after Overwatch 2 and Diablo 4. But ArenaNet is not Blizzard. This is a recent trend, and there is still absolutely enough time to get someone in command of the ship and steer it in the right direction. However, I don't know how much hope I have of that ship being steered in the right direction. The game developers seem to be shifting away from all the things that drew probably a lot of other players into Guild Wars 2 over time. Stuff like elite specializations, and mounts, and new system mechanics. It doesn't seem like the next expansions are going to have any of that kind of stuff, based on what I've researched so far. It seems like the game developers are content being lazy and developing new weapon skills for professions once a year instead of the actual depth of new elite specs and mounts or just new systems in general. Now, I know that this video can seem really ranty. I haven't done one of these in a very long time, and I usually end up deleting these after all the negative comments start rolling in, but I've been a fan of ArenaNet ever since I was a kid, and I just don't like the direction that Guild Wars 2 is taking these days. Seems like it's going to end poorly whenever you have these inexperienced game directors treating the community like a piñata. And hey, if anyone from ArenaNet actually watches this somehow, I am in between contracts right now. I do have a business email attached to this YouTube account. Hint hint, nudge nudge. I'm just saying that I guarantee that I could do a way better job than your current game director. For everyone else, thanks for watching. I know this video was a little weird, but I'm on one of my weird insomniac sleep binges where I can't really sleep, so I've been spending hours every night obsessing and fuming over things that annoy me, and this was just one of those things. For those of you waiting for some of my more non-controversial content, more in the realm of my Starbound videos, I am still building my PC. I'm having trouble finding a GPU right now, but I assure you, as soon as the PC is finished, you will start seeing these videos a lot more often. In any case, again, thank you for watching.